All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of Elevate Your Grind, brought to you by the Cannabis Lab. I am your host, Todd Rosales, and it is so great to do these shows again. All right, folks, I told you last time that my MacBook doesn't like doing the whole speaker view thing anymore. I'm trying something new that Russ, I'll call him our AV guy, but he is so much more when we do our panels. I was watching him do this for the crypto panel. I don't know if it's going to work this way, but it's a lot of pinning and unpinning. So today, guys, as I'm doing this interview, you're going to actually see me trying to produce this show. We'll see how it goes. Luckily, my test subject for today, or my guest for today, she is very used to the PR space and very used to the interview space. So hopefully it won't bother her that I'm moving all frantically while we're talking here. So please welcome my guest today, Tracy Brady, the VP and head of global communications for Curaleaf, a little small company, mom and pop shop. You might have heard of them. Tracy, right. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Happy Friday.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny. It's not very often I get to talk to the head of communications. It's usually the head of communications who's talking to me, and then all of a sudden the person comes in, sits down, it's like, what are we talking about? And then I hear it and then go ahead. It's actually very refreshing to do this. You know, one of the first interviews that I did was Rosie Matteo, and it gave me a lot of insight into that world. I'm sure you know her well. PR, I feel like, is a different beast in cannabis versus other places. I feel like you guys get a much bigger piece of the overall marketing budget and strategy than in most other industries, because it is one of our most free channels, even though it's still restricted. I'd love to hear your input on that.
Yeah, I mean, we call it, you don't call it earned media for nothing. We earn it every day, right? With blood, sweat, and tears. But it is really exciting to be in cannabis and be in the comms and PR space. We sort of live under marketing, but in cannabis, what's really exciting about being in PR and communications is that you touch every piece of the business and you work with every single department, right? So I work very closely with the marketing department on all our product launches, our store openings, any new announcements, anything exciting from the sexier side of things, sponsorships, events, obviously MJ BizCon, all that. But then we also work with the executives, right? In our positioning, executive visibility, panel appearances, and then I work with IR, right? Helping shape the earnings scripts, the earnings press releases, the messaging that we want to give to investors, potential investors. And then you've got the regulators, right? This is the first time in my career, and it's a long career. I'm not going to say how long, but my first time in my career, I've had the chance to go down to DC and, you know, meet members of Congress, congressmen and congresswomen, and try to move legislation for cannabis reform. You know, my dog's barking. So it's pretty exciting. And you mentioned Rosie. Shout out to Rosie, because I was actually one of the first guests on her podcast, and we have a lot to talk about. I think that in the comm space, in the PR space, cannabis is an exciting place to be, because you get to do so much more than just PR.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'd actually love to get into your background, right? Because, you know, I think folks like yourself are definitely thriving in this industry because of the experience that you've had. I mean, we literally just had a call earlier than this. We were going through, you know, our business for Heisman, and someone had called out, you know, PR. And I can quote what I said earlier is I wasn't a believer in it until I got into this industry and I saw the effect. And I think it was Rosie who told me, like, I can't buy an ad in the New York Times, but I can certainly get a story written about it in the New York Times, right? So, right. You know, what did you, obviously I looked at your LinkedIn profile, very high level marketing, communications, things of that nature. What brought you to the cannabis space, you know, coming from a more traditional path?
Yeah, well, my background really, it started in media and entertainment. For a long time, I was in New York and Los Angeles working in the television and movie business. And that's kind of got its own set of chaos and excitement, just like cannabis. And then about, you know, in the early 2000s, I came back to the Boston area and I worked with some pretty cool advertising agencies. I worked with Arnold Worldwide, Modernista, and Holliday. And by doing that, I got to work with some pretty big brands on a variety of different things. You know, we helped bring Volkswagen to the Sundance Film Festival as a sponsor. I worked with Bank of America on their the relaunch of their positioning after the market crash in 2008. And just a lot of different kind of companies, from CPG to nonprofits to healthcare. And when you work at an agency, you know, you get to touch a lot of different pieces of a lot of different businesses. So I had been at Holliday working with clients like Planet Fitness, Novartis, Bank of America, Dunkin' Donuts, Liberty Mutual, all the big ones in this area. And around, I guess like 3-4 years ago, I just started seeing a lot about the cannabis space. And one thing about being in PR, as you probably know, or being in media, you read everything. You read everything you can get your hands on. And so I kept seeing how exciting the space was getting and how it was growing and people were getting into it. And the funny thing was all these bankers and venture capitalists, right? And money people were getting into cannabis. And it wasn't just, smaller kind of shops. It was like big companies getting interested. And so I was just keeping my eye on the space. And Curaleaf at the time, 2.5 years ago, we're based in Wakefield, Mass, and they had an opening. They just had marketing. They didn't have anyone doing comms, PR, and they realized they needed it. They were putting out a lot of press releases and using a lot of different agencies. So I came in, and that was about 2.5 years ago, and it feels like about 10 years ago, in cannabis time, but it's been a pretty wild ride. So I would say to anyone looking to get into the space, any background is really welcome, as long as you've worked hard, managed crisis, been able to be creative. All those things come into play in cannabis, as you probably know.
It's funny that that's often talked about is the people that are working in cannabis, and a lot of Wall Street and bankers and things like that. It's also looked down upon by certain cultures in cannabis, right? And there's the anti-corporate cannabis movement and things like that. It's interesting because I think when the cannabis industry, the legal cannabis industry, really started taking off, you had people from two extremes coming into the industry against each other. And I think the more and more as the industry matures, as any industry matures, there are people that are going to be in the middle, more in the gray area, if you will. So, when the cannabis industry, the legal industry started, you had these legacy growers and legacy cannabis entrepreneurs, and you've also had super passionate cannabis users and cannabis enthusiasts, right, on one side, and they thought it should be done one way. And then, of course, you had Wall Street guys who came in with their egos and their down vests and saying, hey, we know how to build any business, no matter what the medium is, and we're going to come in here and we're gonna make money over these people. And with any nascent industry, I think they realize that they need each other more than anything else. And I think that's something that we'll talk about as this conversation goes on. But it's interesting as the gray starts to come, where people like you and I come in, where we have professional backgrounds, and maybe we're cannabis enthusiasts or not, we see opportunity in the industry, but we have these professional backgrounds that we realize when you look at this industry, it is just that, it's another industry. I can't tell you how many people that, when I say I work in the cannabis space, they just think of the recreational retail side of it, where I'm just selling ace of weed. It's not brand building. There's no, they don't see the need for not only cultivators and cannabis folks, but for truck drivers and accountants and lawyers and creatives. And, and I feel like this industry is truly, I'm going off on tangents here, but, because we're getting more towards this gray, and because people are, when I say I came into this industry, my shoulders dropped a little and I was able to relax. I was able to be myself a little bit more. I didn't have to pretend to be this buttoned up individual that I wasn't, because everybody's kind of figuring it out together, right?
Right.
Those sayings that we have in the industry that don't go away. The one you kind of alluded to is that cannabis years are like dog years. And then the other one is everybody's building the airplane while we're flying. Those are two that, like,
yeah,
you can make a drink.
It doesn't matter what size you are. Everybody is doing that. And, I'm glad you brought up the sort of big corporate versus the little guy, because I think that's really important. We take a lot of heat for being the biggest, and we have our share of critics, of course, all the MSOs do. But, our CEO, Joe Barron, was on a panel at MJ BizCon. I don't know, were you at MJ BizCon last year?
I didn't get a chance to leave the Cosmopolitan, but yes, I was there.
Yeah, I know, right? You got to get out of the hotel. But so he led a panel, and it was really interesting because it was like Clash of the Titans, and the panel was sort of about old school versus like the new guys, right? Like cannabis culture, legacy players, and what is the relationship between them and, the sort of more corporate, the larger MSOs who have, a lot of more resources. And I think that what he said was really important, is that this industry is going to grow together, as you said, and it's still a new industry, right? We're in early innings. And if we don't collaborate and work together and figure out the space together, I don't think anybody's going to win. I mean, obviously we have scale and resources and relationships that are going to help the smaller growers, the smaller farms. And we've tried to do a lot of that. And we've tried to bridge that gap with our Rooted in Good CSR program, where we have a lot of partnerships, and we try to reach out to the smaller community folks who are building brands, who are starting businesses. So I think that, we sort of have a saying, and it's a little bit trite, but I think it's true that big cannabis can be good cannabis, because good cannabis is good business, right? So I think what you said is true, that the two parties, and there's not just two, right? There's every different size. And like you said, there's room for truck drivers and scientists and people who do packaging and people who work on lighting fixtures and people who have the best ideas about greenhouses and people who know how to manufacture and who have those sort of proprietary tools. There's so much room in this industry and for so many different sizes of companies and individuals that I think that it's really important that we all support each other and work together.
Absolutely. And I can be honest, I'm one of these people who I see both sides of the fence and both sides of the argument, right? We talk about big cannabis versus legacy. And if we look at any other industry, you can't look at cannabis in a vacuum, right? It is an industry, whether it came from the black market or not. If you're a winemaker and you put a ton of passion into your wine and you walk the grape fields every day, and I know nothing about winemaking for anybody who's watching this, but you walk the fields and you put your heart and soul into it, and it's your family business or whatever it is, the same legacy that some of these cannabis growers have. That doesn't mean that you understand that complex regulatory environment that it requires for you to get your wine from California into the rest of the country through these complicated distribution channels, and then figuring out how to do your taxes. Like, no matter what, if you're growing wine, I guarantee you have somebody doing your taxes. You're not doing your own taxes, right? I mean, whether it's a personal level or you're a large business. So when we look at the cannabis industry, we do have these legacy entrepreneurs and operators that you need some traditional business people. You need Bob in accounting. You need, Sheila in legal. Like, that's just how it works.
And branding and marketing too is a huge part of it. And another sort of like really hard thing for the average layperson who's not in the industry to understand is getting a license is only one part of this industry. If you have a license, well, guess what? You need to understand how to, you need access to capital, right? You need to understand how to operate a retail business. You need to understand that your taxes are going to be very different than any other CPG industry, right? Everybody knows about 280E and the punishing taxes that this industry pays. You need to understand about labor and hiring people. And do you know that you're going to have to hire security, right? Do you know that you're going to be operating fully in cash because we haven't gotten safe banking yet? So you got to think about all those things. And to someone who's never operated, retail business, it's very different. And right. So even folks from the legacy market who are moving over and want to get licenses and start their own businesses in legal, it's obviously very different than operating in the legacy market. So there's a lot of things that you can learn from other folks who have different backgrounds.
Absolutely. What I would love to see, where I think this is actually going, and you can kind of confirm for me or not, is I think a lot of the MSOs, such as Curaleaf and yourself, you guys have done a great job about becoming these giant platforms for cannabis, right? You have household name recognition amongst the average American, not just the people who are cannabis folks, right? You're in so many different geographies. Your signage alone is recognizable in the cannabis space, to where companies like yours and companies like the other MSOs that we don't need to mention by name right now almost become platforms to give these legacy entrepreneurs a larger audience to tell their authentic stories, right? Where, like, I don't think every product in every state, and it's only in Florida where I have a very, restrained view of it. Like, it's not all Curaleaf products. So if you can find some of these legacy growers, you give them a fair deal, they're happy with it, they're able to take care of their family without having to look over their shoulder. And they now have this platform to tell their story, that they've, this journey they've gone over the past 10, 20, 30, 50 years, whether it's their family heritage, and they now have the ability to become like a pseudo celebrity in the space. I see that being where ultimately the legacy market, and we'll call it the new market or the legal market, coming together and really delivering the best of both worlds. And I hope that's what everybody's working towards.
I hope it is too, because I was just thinking as you were talking about that, we may be a name recognized brand, but there are always going to be people who don't want to walk into a Curaleaf dispensary, just like there are people who don't want to buy from the illicit market or from the legacy market, right? And that's why developing a variety of different products with different brands is so important for the larger MSOs, because you want to be able to service a wide variety of customers. And if you're from the legacy market coming into the legal market, you want to be able to reach new customers, right? The soccer mom or the tennis dad might not necessarily have been a client of yours, but in the legal business, part of our job is to make cannabis more acceptable as a health and wellness product, as well as an adult recreational product. It's funny when you think about alcohol, and nobody thinks about this today, but 100 years ago, whatever it was, prohibition, alcohol was suffering some of the same stigma, right? It was evil. It was obviously illegal. There was moonshine you could get. And to think that, like, where alcohol is today, being, basically the sponsor of the Super Bowl and giant marketing and advertising budgets, And being like the Anheuser-Busch of the alcohol world is very different than being a very small craft beer made in Vermont. But guess what? There's audiences for both, right? There's consumers who want one or the other. And then there's consumers like me and maybe even you, where I'm in a boat in the summertime, I'm going to have a Bud Light, with lime for sure. But then if I'm in Vermont skiing, of course, I'm going to go patronize those local brewers, right? And have those products too. So I feel like there's room in the market for all different kinds of products and all different kinds of brands. And that's why I think it's so important for the two, sides or whatever you want to call it to work together. Because a lot of times some of the bigger companies can, they can learn from legacy market as far as growing different strains and knowing the culture a little bit better. And certainly the legacy players can learn from the bigger players with resources and scale and marketing and branding and legal and accounting and all those kinds of things that they haven't had to deal with before, that the corporate world, deals with every day.
I agree. And I do think this industry has the ability to be a model industry for a lot of others, just in how accepting it seems to be, at least when you work with the right people, right? To your point, you bring up the prohibition of alcohol, which is something I talked about a lot early on in this show, because I compared, the prohibition of cannabis to it, obviously much longer. But I feel like the similarities are so much there, where you're like, alcohol had those same stigmas. It even had the same ability where the people who were prohibiting alcohol were also the ones that were in the speakeasies and drinking it too, where
Right.
they would do it behind closed doors, where you kind of had to figure, is this person cool or not, if you can even have a discussion about it, or if you can invite them to your place. And cannabis is very much the same way. Even though right now I feel like the stigma has lessened around cannabis, but it really hasn't changed, right? If you have someone who doesn't regularly use cannabis, or at least use it, I guess, regularly, and however you define that is your own definition, but they don't understand someone who uses it often, right? Like, there are people in my life that I know that smoke weed every day, and they are lazy couch potatoes, right? But that's because they're lazy couch potatoes who smoke weed. There are also people in my life that smoke weed every day, and they are some of the most successful people I've ever seen, and work harder than anyone I've seen. They're the most focused, they're the most educated. It's just because that's the way their brain is wired, and sometimes this plant gives them the ability to slow down their thoughts, or speed up their thoughts, or organize their thoughts and everything else. And to explain that to someone who smoked a bunch of weed in college just recreationally, and did it, while they were drinking and while they were partying, it's hard to get them to see that. So even though they might be like, oh yeah, it's cool, cannabis, I'm glad it's legal, they still might look at you as like, oh, that guy's just a stoner still. So I feel like it's not just one general stigma we have to fight. I feel like there are a lot of micro stigmas we have to fight.
Well, I was going to say something kind of funny, and that's what we have marketing for, Todd, right? I mean, would you ever have imagined 100 years ago the position that alcohol has in our society and the power that it has in culture? I mean, the whole restaurant and bar industry is based around the consumption of that product, really. So to think of one day cannabis being that way, right? Having consumption lounges that are okay, being able to walk into a store without any stigma. And I do think that I'm going to pat our industry on the back, and pat the communications and PR people on the back. We've done a lot in the last couple of years to kind of break down that stigma. And the way you do that is by telling the real stories of real people. Obviously, we don't have the benefit of federally funded studies, right? So we can't back up scientific studies, but we have thousands and thousands of anecdotal histories of patients who come in and talk to us. And these are people who are old, young, men, women, every possible ethnic background, even some parents of kids, epileptic children, who have found relief. Obviously, everyone knows the story of Charlotte's Web.
Yeah.
But it's by telling these stories that makes it okay for people to understand that this is a plant and it's been around for thousands of years. And not to mention, really educating people around the war on drugs and what that did to communities of color, and marginalizing these folks, and how important it is to have them be part of this new industry. I'm sure you've probably seen Fab Five Freddy's film, Grass is Greener. That's, if anyone hasn't seen it, you really have to watch it, especially if you're in the industry, to really understand what happened around this plant and how it was used to criminalize a whole community of people. And so I think that, we're sort of going off on a tangent here, but I think it's really important to continue to tell the stories, not just of recreational users, of how it helps creative people or how it helps people, athletes, wind down, but regular everyday folks who you would never have imagined using cannabis, like your arthritic grandma, the mom who wants to relax and maybe not have a glass of Chardonnay and have a gummy instead. And the more we tell these stories and the more we humanize them, the more I think we're going to create an acceptance of this plant that we haven't ever seen before. And that's what's really exciting to me about being in this industry, is working on a product that is natural and has been around and has been criminalized, and turning that around and making it a positive thing, not just for business, but for communities, tax revenue, jobs, getting people out of jail, with expungement clinics, and trying to give people jobs who were imprisoned for doing exactly what this industry is doing.
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, we're finally starting to see that, and then hopefully this administration continues to do what they promised to do when they're running. But we don't need to get political on this show. I look at the stigma so much, and I do think we've done a ton. Like, cannabis is somewhat acceptable, but I still feel like there are these legacy stigmas. I mean, there's tons of legacy stigmas there, but there's stigmas around, like, if I'm smoking a joint in a relatively public place or around other people, that still, to me, feels frowned upon. Right. And I could be wrong, and maybe it's my own insecurities, but like, people, I think the same people who see the Charlotte's Web story, or know people like Erica Daniels and Hope Grows for Autism, with cannabis use for autism, they see these amazing stories. For some reason, their brain doesn't connect it to smoking a joint. Right. And if I'm a relatively healthy human being, like, well, I don't need cannabis for epilepsy or autism or for any of these things to feel homeostasis, but people would be okay with me taking an Adderall or a Ritalin,
Right.
or any of these other pills. But if I smoke a joint and they see an actual physical smoking of a joint, it just goes back to that stoner mentality. And that's the crazy thing to me, right? You bring a bottle of wine or a bottle of booze to a party, and, hey man, thank you for that, it's great. But if I show up with a pack of pre-rolls, like, there's going to be a good amount of people that are looking at me like, oh, he's that guy. Right?
Well, but I don't know. I'm going to push back, because if you show up with a pack of pre-rolls that's branded, from a company, whatever your favorite company is, like, for example, I'm going to throw out one of ours. B Noble has an awesome 2-pack of pre-rolls. B Noble, I don't know if you know, Bernard Noble is a man who was imprisoned in Louisiana for basically having the equivalent of 2 joints. And he's featured in Fab Five Freddy's film. And so we worked with him to help launch the B Noble brand, right? So when somebody knows the story behind a brand, like, here's someone who went to jail for cannabis possession, who now has his own brand and has his own entrepreneurial company, basically celebrating what was once punishable, with a felony. That's a different story. When you bring that story, and that's what branding and packaging and marketing is all about. When you bring those stories in, it becomes much more acceptable. And what I would say to you is, smoking a joint is one thing. Think about the way you look at someone who's smoking a cigarette now, not to bash anybody who smokes cigarettes, but it's much, much different than it was even 5, 10, 15 years ago. Think about when you were in high school, the people who smoked. I mean, smoking was a normal thing. And now when someone's smoking outside, you think, you take a second look, because society has really educated the public on the health issues around smoking, the dangers of secondhand smoke, what have you, minority use of smoking. But my point is that, like, public perceptions and public attitudes can change. You can change culture, just the way alcohol was changed, just the way, OxyContin was not a bad word 15 years ago. But today, you bring that to a party, like, people are going to look at you very differently. Even if you have a torn ACL and you have an injury, you have a bottle of OxyContin, people are really going to look at you differently. And that's the role of storytelling and changing the narrative around something. And we have a lot of work to do, but I think that we've done a lot of work, and, our patients and customers are the most important people that can continue to spread that message and to deliver that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, to shamelessly plug our own company here, that's what we do at Heisman. We have one of the original, with Ricky Williams at the helm. The dude walked away in 2004 from the game, and walked away from a $6 million contract because he wanted to be himself and continue to use cannabis to treat himself versus everything else that was being put on him. You bring up OxyContin and the opiates and the ulcers that he's had and everything else like that. Whereas, a lot of these athletes are using cannabis, and they've had to be quiet about it. You see them starting to come out now. We're talking about the NBA bubble, where they were all locked in, a contained environment for COVID, and they were smoking weed in there. And just, it's better. Like, I was never a professional athlete. I never made it past the high school level. And, but I do work out and stuff. And I can tell you that sometimes cannabis enhances either the workout or the recovery, right? You talk about OxyContin. I can't tell you how many surgeries I've had or procedures done where they give me pain pills, and maybe I'll take 1 or 2 the day of the procedure or the day after, depending on the level of pain. But I'll use cannabis going forward to kind of, like, it doesn't exactly take the pain away, but it just makes it bearable. And it's not something that you have to worry about getting addicted to, because I do have a very addictive personality, it's just who I am. Right. So, I forget where I was going with that.
Well, now that you bring up Ricky, I wanted us to talk about celebrities, right? And celebrity brands.
Yeah.
I think Ricky is, really one of the super legitimate stories that we hear about, right? Like it's one thing for a celebrity or an actor or an actress to suddenly adopt a brand, but when somebody like Ricky Williams like steps forward and admits and embraces cannabis use, and tells his own personal story, I feel like that is so much more powerful. And I wonder, I want to kind of interview you a little bit about Ricky,
Cool.
and,
I
about
agree with you.
and his advocacy in the space, because I think we can learn a lot from people like him who have bravely come forward. And I'm hoping that a lot more professional athletes do. We've seen the leagues kind of change their stance against cannabis, and we've seen companies stop testing against cannabis and stop preventing people from getting a job just because they've admitted that they've used cannabis. So curious to hear about Ricky's journey and, any other celebrities you've come into contact with in the space, because I think they're really crucial to telling the story.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm obviously very happy to share. Ricky was doing it. I met, so a lot of people don't realize, I don't get to talk about this often because I'm usually on the other side of the camera, but like I met Ricky when I was 16. I met him again when I was 32 or 33, and he had a huge impact on my life, albeit very small at 16. I look at a guy like Ricky and I understand why he had the ability to walk away from the game of football, because he knew that wasn't who he was as a person. He knew that wasn't what was going to define him, but that gave him a platform to tell his story and share his insight. I can tell you, when I talk about the stigma of cannabis and the things that I do, like, smoking a joint in public places and being worried about it and everything else, I wish I had the confidence to be Ricky Williams, because this man is unapologetically himself and he's so authentic, right? Where he doesn't worry about that stuff because he knows who he is. He knows what cannabis does for him. He knows the experiences that he's had with it. And the man is clearly, gone from athlete to activist to now entrepreneur in multiple businesses, including finally having his own cannabis brand, right? And I think there isn't anybody else that deserves it more. But to your entire point with the celebrity angle, I think there are so many celebrities that we're at an inflection point right now where they've been using cannabis and they've been using it in a positive light for so long, whether they be athletes or creatives or anything else, that they're starting to realize that the Seth Rogans of the world, the Snoop Dogs of the world, the Ricky Williams of the world, that they're not being put in this demonized category that cannabis celebrities used to be put in, right? I think Snoop Dogg's cannabis use went from publicly frowned upon to publicly celebrated. And,
Right.
and that all happened. He never changed who he was as a person. He was Snoop, Seth Rogen, same way. On the other celebrity angle, and I'd be love to get your feedback on this, I think there are a lot of them that are, I don't want to say doing it for the wrong reasons, but they're not authentic stories, where they're a cannabis who might consume, or not cannabis, a celebrity that might consume cannabis, that might have cannabis in their journey somehow, but they're not telling the authentic story, and it's not part of who they are. It's just a part of their business portfolio. The same way George Clooney, like, he wasn't a tequila, like he drank tequila, but he's an actor, right? He's a very famous actor, a very damn good actor. So, when you get some of these authentic stories like Seth Rogen, who's for years saying that he's used cannabis the same way people use classes, it's just part of his life, you get a really authentic story. To the other side of it, you would think that Snoop would have one of the biggest brands in the industry, and he doesn't, right? And there are other brands that I can go into, but now that I am a brand, I don't want to talk badly about them from a celebrity standpoint. Yeah. But I feel like the reason that Heisman and the reason that we have the messaging we do is not because Ricky was a celebrity and not because he rushed for 10,000 yards in the NFL rushing title and he won, countless trophies and everything else, but because Ricky is authentically himself, and cannabis is part of his authentic self. And it is a big part of his journey, and it continues to be. And I think those are the celebrities going forward that we're going to see find a lot of success in this industry when they're being authentic, and not even just the celebrities, but brands in general. I'd mentioned earlier, giving these legacy growers and entrepreneurs a platform to tell their story. I think they're the next cannabis industry celebrities, because they have these amazing stories, these unique stories, these entertaining stories. And where we are as a culture. You know, if we drop documentaries about these people on Netflix, it'd be the #1 in the country. So like, I think that is the next wave. I don't think the celebrities that are coming into this industry, I don't think a lot of them are going to come out of Hollywood. I think they're going to come out of Humboldt more.
Yeah, no, you have a good point. But what I would say is, there are certain kinds of consumers that are always going to be attracted to and follow certain celebrity brands. Now that we're in the social media and influencer culture, that's just a fact of life. And I would say you can look at that as a good thing, right? So you can introduce new consumers and new demographics to the market that maybe you wouldn't have had before. And maybe some of those folks will turn away from, using alcohol or using pharmaceuticals because they've discovered cannabis, and it might be because of a celebrity that might not have the most authentic story. But it's just like celebrities getting into organic foods or all natural cleaning products, something like that. If that convinces more people that that's a sensible alternative, then that's a good thing.
Agreed.
Right?
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. I just, like I said, I just want to make sure that, as being a quote unquote celebrity brand, I just want to make sure that the authenticity is there and that stays in the industry, right? I think you're right. If we can help use these celebrities' platforms to spread the message, it's the best thing that we can absolutely do. And I'm always curious, right? Because there's so many, I don't want to say so many brands, but the kind of curious has always been this category that we all talk about, all these people that are on the fence about cannabis. I'm curious to know what's going to push them over the edge. Is it going to be the appeal of cannabis, or is it going to be a bad experience with another thing, right? And that's what I'm curious to know, because cannabis has been around, and obviously it's been a giant pain in the ass to get until it's been legal. But what is it, the person who goes to Total Wine once a week, what do we get them to do to right. drive past Total Wine and go into Curaleaf?
Well, I think the answer there is form factors, right? There's a lot of people who don't, like to your point earlier, who don't want the stigma of smoking a joint, right? They don't like the odor. I myself can't really smoke because I just cough.
My doctor, when I told her that I consume cannabis, she's like, that's great. Just try not to smoke it so much. Try to do edibles.
Right. Nothing against those who like to smoke, because I understand that that's the legacy and that's part of the whole culture and part of the whole ritual. But for me, I'm super excited. I like gummies, and I like the beverage products. We have a product called Squeeze that you can just add to a beverage. So I mix that with seltzer and fruit, and I really like the way that can replace alcohol at a party or at a dinner. And then there's other things, more beverages coming. Right? More beverage products, seltzers that are going to be fun packaging and great colors, and it's going to appeal to a whole new demographic. But then you've also got tinctures, of course, you've got all different kinds of form factors. So there's something for everybody. I think that's what's going to lead the Canna Curious. Like, I hate to say, I keep talking about packaging, but I'm a sucker for great packaging, right? And like, for example, next week, we're launching select CBD Bites. And there's different cannabinoids in each one for, helps you with sleep, and one helps you relax, and one helps you with recovery. And those flavors and those colors and those different sort of, if you were in the snacking business, it'd be called snacking occasions. These are called like cannabis occasions, right? So there's just a different kind of approach for consumers who aren't necessarily smokers, who might want a beverage, who might want a gummy, who might want chocolate. Right. And then there's the other, sort of connoisseurs who want shatter, right. And who want to dab. So I think the more products we can create, some people like botanical terpenes. Some people think they're, the worst thing ever to come into the industry, but there's room for both, right? There's people who just want their pure cannabis oil, and there's other people who like a hint of lavender or pine or whatever, who like those flavors. The one thing that's so interesting about this industry is people are extremely passionate about their own point of view.
Yes.
And that's really difficult, coming from my perspective.
Myself included.
Yeah. Well, as a PR and communications person, it's like, well, if you don't smoke this way, or if you don't enjoy weed this way, or if you're this kind of distributor and you're not what I think you should be, then, you're automatically evil, and I'm going to discount you, and I'm going to troll you on social media. And it's just not productive. It's not good for the industry. It's not good for the big players or the small players, because it just creates toxicity.
I hate saying it. I think it's just where we are as a country. I don't think it's just our industry. I think trolling is just.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, trolling is literally just part of our culture, unfortunately. Like, I mean, I don't need to get into it, but like, there are certain things that when you survey your network of people that in person, you get a 75% opinion one way, and then if you go on Twitter or social media, you get a 95% opinion the other way, and you're like, I don't know any of these people. And I'm certainly not in, being in the cannabis industry, there is a very eclectic group mix of people that it's not like I'm surrounding myself with the same type of person to get that 75% thing. Having said that, we don't need to dive into politics again. It seems to keep creeping in. I'm interested to hear your opinion on what you think the form factor or form factors might be for mass level social consumption, right? Like you talk about alcohol, which is so permeates every part of our society. You go anywhere and there's drinks. Like I go take my kid to the zoo, they have beer. I go to Disneyland, they have full alcohol menus, right? And those are very kid centric, but they know that the parents are there and the parents want to unwind, right? So they have places for that. You go to sporting games, anywhere. Alcohol, you go to someone's house, you go on a boat, no matter where you go, there's typically booths, children's birthday parties, it's there for the parents, right? So at some point, whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years, 20 years from now, I believe cannabis will get there. As I've mentioned, I don't think it's the joint. I do think it's the beverage, and I don't think it's edible because it's not natural, right? You go to a bar, you go to a social gathering, you're standing up, you're not going to be holding a plate of chocolates and kind of eat one every 10 minutes as the night goes on.
Not.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
I think it is beverages. I really do think it is. And obviously there's a lot of seltzer brands already. Summer's coming, so there's going to be a whole, new slew of opportunities on the market for flavors and different sort of the way it's packaged. I think that, speaking just personally, you're right. I mean, the alcohol has created the kind of culture and the social occasion to have something in your hand.
If I don't have a cup, I don't know what to do with my hands.
Exactly.
I'm not joking.
But think about it. I mean, 50 years ago, I don't know if you're a fan of Mad Men, there's no scene in that series where someone doesn't have a cigarette in their hand, right? That was natural, and that was part of the culture then.
I wanted to become a cigarette smoker so bad during the 5 seasons of that show, just knowing how bad it was.
And look at the way we look at smoking now, So I do think it's beverages, and I think there will become a day. And I know there's cannabis lounges, in certain markets. I know Illinois is one, but I do see a day when you can go in and you can have food and a beverage and maybe even a tea, or there's all kinds of opportunities for you to use cannabis either as edible or as a beverage, and smoke too, if that's what you want to do. So I think we're getting there with acceptance. It's going to be a long road, but to your point, yeah, I think right now the entryway is beverages for sure.
For sure. I mean, like I said, I am a joint smoker through and through. I think that's just because for me, it's something about the inhaling and the exhaling. But my wife doesn't. She's not a smoker. So if we were to go to a consumption lounge and it was smoky and everything else, she would hate it, and you come out smelling like smoke and everything else, and it's just not for everybody.
But what if she could order a salad and have a little sprinkling of a tincture on your salad dressing?
Probably be nachos, but yeah, we'll sprinkle of a tincture on the cheese, maybe. I don't
Cannabis
know.
cheese. Now that's an idea right there.
It's $1 billion idea in itself. Cannabis nacho cheese. Put it on everything. Maybe Parmesan. So before, I know we've been talking for a little bit here. I want the last thing I want to talk about is, because we talked about all the great stuff. We talked about, destigmatizing the industry. We've talked about the challenges around big cannabis versus legacy market. You were someone who's had an entire communications career before you came into cannabis. And when I say entire, I mean, it's not like you started for a year or two and then jumped into cannabis or started writing cannabis. You've done this before. What were the major challenges that you've seen coming from other industries, or was it easier because people were hungry for cannabis stories because this is where it was? From a marketing standpoint, before you get kicked off, we are super restricted. We're extremely restricted, and there are not many channels that we are allowed to use. Media and earned media happens to be one of the major and best ways to do it. So, I'd love to know, as you transitioned into this industry, like what parts of your playbook where you're like, well, let's do, oh crap, okay, let's do, oh crap, you can't do that.
Yeah. So as you say, the regulatory hurdles were the biggest. I would say number one, the regulatory issues, where I didn't know that, being in 23 states, you have 23 different sets of regulations. That's something that is a huge learning curve for people when they come in, right? When I came in, you couldn't use the word gummy in New York. We had to call our new gummy product a sublingual gel because it's a medical market, right? So that was really challenging. How do you talk to medical patients versus how do you talk to potential adult use? Some of the markets were obviously medical only and still are. Some are adult use and medical. So different sets of kind of the PR playbook for both of those folks. We always wanted to have spokespeople, but again, as you know, you can't make you can't make medical claims. If you do that, you get into trouble with the FDA and other regulatory issues. So you want to have your patients be able to tell your stories, because you're not making those claims. But if patients or regular consumers can tell the stories of how those products have impacted their lives and how cannabis has had a positive impact on their health and wellness routine, and they can do that, and you can help guide them, but not, put yourself front and center, but let the patients and the people tell their own stories. That's been really effective. And that's something different than, any kind of PR or communications for a different brand or different kind of company. The biggest sort of parallel I can think of in my past career is when I worked, at an ad agency, and we had some healthcare clients. We had some pharma companies, right, and healthcare, and there was a lot of rules about how you could talk about different products. I mean, everybody jokes about the pharmaceutical commercials that have more side effect warnings than they do the benefits of the product. So that was, it's completely different, but in the same way, you have to think like, how can I make this interesting? How can I make this sexy and safe and fun and work, and a narrative and a story that people want to hear about, versus just your standard textbook press release. And that's kind of the funnest thing about being in cannabis, when you have new products and you get to talk about an extended release gummy or a new beverage, or the B Noble product that has such an amazing story behind it with Bernard Noble, his personal story. But then, every press release has to go through legal, has to go through compliance, has to go through marketing, has to go through the state folks, so that's
it's stale by the time it gets to the wire.
Yeah, well, no, not necessarily. But then, you can be a little more exciting in the quotes than you can in the body of the press release. So there's things you learn. And then, I don't really make a move without talking to legal and compliance. There's been situations where I've had to turn down an opportunity on a national morning show because we were worried about making claims. And that's just a huge shame. You can't go on a national morning show and tell the world about something that's beneficial and that helps somebody. But you can spend, whatever $1 million during 60 Minutes to try to get people on a pharmaceutical that they may not even need for a syndrome that they might not even know they had you not made a commercial about it. So that's kind of like what gets me up in the morning, is knowing the way the plant has changed people's lives and helped them. And knowing what it's done in the past with the war on drugs and marginalizing communities, and trying to make those things right, by bringing those communities and providing opportunities, whether it's entrepreneurs or brands or other businesses that are trying to break into this industry, and trying to help them and create a path so that there's opportunity for everyone. I kind of got away from your question, but I used to think, I always tell people this, I used to think it was difficult, like managing Hollywood celebrities and, doing the PR and communications campaign for a major film release. And that's nothing compared to launching cannabis products in 23 different states.
Agreed. And we're only doing it in 2 right now. I can't imagine what it's going to be like as we do more. It's funny. I said that was the last thing, but I have one more thing for you. I'm curious to know your take on this. I feel like, and I don't think this is any prolific statement that nobody's thought of, but the legalization of cannabis just hit at the right time in the world, to where the internet is really the primary form of the way that people consume media right now. So I'm a big fan of comedy and stand-up comedy specifically, and obviously that's where I got the podcasting idea from. But you have all these comedians, and we're in a golden age of comedy, and I know this is a cannabis podcast, where you have all these funny people that had to go through executives and agents and traditional channels to become famous and to get their comedy out there in the past, to where there are actually major comedians right now that are releasing their specials for free on YouTube, because you can make some money on YouTube, but it's all about selling tickets, right? So now they have their own podcasts, they build their own networks, they have their own YouTube channels, they're essentially becoming the network themselves, right? So I apply that to the cannabis space, where we have so many restrictions, and there are so many pieces of earned media, right? There's so much that ABC, NBC, CBS will put on their news channels, right? You talk about major morning shows. I don't know if this is the one you're talking about, you don't have to admit it, but like, there's only one Today Show. So are they going to have, 5 different MSO CEOs on within a year period? Maybe not, right? So if we didn't have YouTube and we didn't have Instagram and Twitter, you know, and all that, do you think that PRA would be as strong, and B, that this industry would start being as big as it is because we wouldn't have the medium to tell our stories authentically?
Interesting question. You know, social media, you know, it's such sort of the bane of my existence, but you're right. And to your point, when we have a story that we want to tell and we can't get it placed for whatever reason, we always have our own channels, right? So you have paid, earned, and owned. Owned channels are really important. So we have 4 different social media channels just on the executive side. And then we have Instagram, of course, so we can tell our stories there, but those are heavily regulated. But we also have our website, right? Where we can put up testimonials. We can put up things that we want to say about products. And we have a blog, right? So you're right. Without the internet, it would be much, much harder. But I think that, you know, by continuing to pull out the other stories, not just the story of cannabis or the story of how cannabis helps somebody, but the other elements of that person or that individual's life. That person might have other things to say. So you've got to be really creative about trying to pitch those stories to what I call traditional media, right? They're not interested that somebody, you know, found relief through cannabis. They might be interested if somebody went to jail for cannabis and then found relief for cannabis, or if that person has a child that they searched and searched for relief for that child with a certain condition. Maybe it's epilepsy, or somebody who has had a relative with terminal cancer, right? And that person's life and how difficult it was to be a caretaker for that person. So again, I keep going back to storytelling because I think that whatever the medium is, whether it's traditional media, a national morning show, a local newspaper, or your own blog, if you just keep telling those stories and putting that narrative out there, hopefully it takes hold. And then, you know, kind of have a saying in the business, nothing gets publicity like publicity. So, you know, you get a little bit of stories here and then you keep building upon that. And it's like a pyramid effect. Like once you have a few press clippings or a few people saying that your product is good or that your company is good or that, you know, this person has an interesting story to tell, the more people that say that, the more opportunities you have to build upon that and to get even more impressions and to get bigger and more impactful media hits. And that's kind of how you have to approach it.
Very cool. I think it is extremely interesting. I think the fact that we do have our channels, even though they are regulated, it does help us a lot. I mean, you know, something like this show wouldn't be on any
T-shirt right there. T-shirt's doing a lot of work for you right now. Your T-shirt, you know, stickers, pins. You know, our bud tenders have all kinds of pins that they have, and it's just there's so many different ways to kind of remind people of your brand and your company and your message and your products. And that's one of the things that's so cool. You have to be creative. You have no choice. You have to be creative because otherwise the regulators will come down on you, right?
Literally the entire reason why I started the show is because I started having conversations with people. I'm like, it's so interesting how the people in this industry think and how we can all think out of the box and figure out the right ways around the regulations. Like, I know it's dumb, but I used to be a big Howard Stern fan back in the day before he was on Sirius, because one of the appeals of Howard was how he got around what the FCC wouldn't allow him to do. Right? And then you look at that now, we literally have an entire industry to where we do that within reason. I don't want to say that people are breaking the rules or breaking the laws, but we have to find new channels and new ways of communication to reach the customer because everything is so regulated in a dumb way. And I'll be the one to say that.
Well, I'm not going to say that. You can. I respect the regulators.
I do, but
it's important. Their role is important.
Yes, but they should also treat us like everything else. So,
yeah.
But again, podcast host, I can say that. So, I don't have a PR person. If I did, they'd probably be very angry right now.
They would. They'd be in the corner yelling at you, right?
Well,
they'd be over there going.
Exactly. I have a dog that was barking earlier, so hopefully she was okay with what I was saying. But Tracy, this has been awesome. I really enjoyed the conversation. The insight is great. I truly believe that people like you are very important in this industry because we do need to tell these stories, and we need to be able to access the platforms to tell these stories. And like you said, it's these stories that are going to fight the stigma of cannabis and make it more mainstream. So before we let you go, if there's anything you want to leave us with, if there's anything you want to promote, website, social media, any of that, let's.
Yeah, I mean, obviously everybody knows who we are, the website Curaleaf, and I would encourage everybody to check out our Rooted in Good program. We just released our first annual social impact report, kind of measuring us and keeping us honest about some of the commitments we've made in social equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and sustainability. So that was exciting. And I encourage everybody to visit a Curaleaf or visit a dispensary near you.
Absolutely, folks. They have some great stores down here in Florida. The Select brand is definitely one of the top brands in the country, in my opinion.
And Monday, CBD Bites coming out, select CBD Bites.
Check that out. All right, folks.
Thanks
This
so
has been
much.
another episode of Elevate Your Grind. Go over to our YouTube page at youtube.com/elevate your grind if you missed this episode or any episodes. On top of that, join us on 5/26 at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. We're going to have our annual pitch slam, and stay tuned for more information on our annual conference, folks. It's been another episode of Elevate Your Grind. See you next time.